in most cases, it's no longer enough to just make a promise, right? It's no longer enough to just make a promise. There's really only one exception to this rule or this advice, and that is if you are making a promise that nobody else is making, then you can simply make the promise. If you are the first person, the first vendor, the first entrepreneur, the first business to make a particular promise to a market, a promise of outcome, a promise of transformation, a promise of benefit, a promise of result that nobody else has made before, you don't need a big marketing idea. You just need to make the promise, and you need to make the promise as explicitly and clearly as possible, and you need to do it up front right away, and then you need to explain how you are going to deliver on that promise, right? And so if you are making a promise no one else is, you just make it. But if you're making a promise of result, if you're promising them something that they've heard before, that they've been promised before, in order to really cut through the clutter and get their attention, you need an interesting way to present that promise. And let me just say this, let me add in this. When you are presenting it, and because I want to simplify things for you, and I want to clarify just a couple of things before we get to the first submission. So if you are making a promise that nobody else has made before, all you have to do is just make the promise, make it as boldly and clearly as possible, and then explain how you are going to deliver on that promise. If you are making a promise of result or transformation that the market has heard before, that the market is either been presented with before or is currently being presented with, then you need to present that promise along with a unique mechanism, meaning that you need to have, so it's kind of like, let's just do it like this. Let me just write this. Let me do it like this for you. So, right, if you have a unique promise, so a unique promise, all you got to do is just present that unique promise, okay? If you have a promise, right, and so this is just a kind of a, we're just calling this a common promise, a typical promise, you have to present that promise and you have to combine it with a unique mechanism, right? Because so you have to understand, if you look at both of these, right? If you look at both of these right here, the key thing is that we have something that is differentiating what you're presenting, differentiation, right, from what you are presenting compared to everything else. In the first example, or in the first instance, right, the differentiation comes in the unique promise. In the second example, where we don't have a unique promise, we have to have a unique delivery method. So the way that your folks experience the promise is with a unique method. The thing that you can't do, or the thing that you don't want to do, is you don't want to take an ordinary common promise and just present the promise, right? Because your message is going to fall on deaf ears. You're now competing with every other vendor out there offering the same result. When you have a common promise and all you do is present that common promise, you now become the ultimate commodity. You're very easy to ignore. You're viewed as marketing advertising. You're just more of the same. This really just becomes more noise, right? And so it's easy for you to be ignored. Now, the key thing today, especially today, as third-party traffic platforms are becoming more and more strict with the type of copy that you write and run. It's very difficult to get a promise-driven appeal. It's near impossible today to get a promise-driven appeal approved on, let's say, a platform like Facebook. And so what we do to get attention is we take either the unique promise or the promise plus unique mechanism, and we wrap it in a big idea. The big idea, right, is the idea behind how you're going to present your your message. Like there's a lot of different ways that you can present, let's say, a weight loss product, right? Like there's a lot of different ways you could wrap it in, you could talk about health, you could use a fear-based idea, you could talk about kind of a more positive, let's just call it for argument's sake, greed-based idea. You could talk about the science behind it. You could talk about the mechanism. Like there's a lot of different ideas that you can use to present the promise and unique mechanism, or the unique promise. The big idea is just there to get attention. It's really just there to stop the prospect, to get them to want to hear more, right? And then what we do is really typically in the lead, we're introducing either the unique promise or the promise plus unique mechanism. So we're using the big idea to get attention, and then we are immediately introducing folks to the promise, either a unique promise or the typical promise backed and delivered by a unique mechanism. Now, this, you've heard me say this before, so this should really be nothing new to you, but there's a couple of things that I just want to stress. As I've gotten a lot of submissions, both in here and as part of the Top One Mastermind group, and even folks in our Facebook group just asking others for feedback. I've seen a lot of different big ideas, and what seeing from a number of people that are taking their first crack at the big idea is that they're getting too clever for their own good. They're getting too clever for their own good as it relates to the big idea. You've got to remember, when it comes to the idea for your marketing, it needs to be something that your prospects can immediately grasp, that they immediately understand, that immediately resonates with them, and that is simple, right? There's a weird thing that, as crazy as this sounds, there's a weird thing in neuroscience that talks about how simple ideas tend to be much more believable than complex ideas. Ideas that can be explained simply in simple to understand language are much more easily believed than are complex or convoluted ideas. And so the more complex and convoluted your idea becomes, the more questionable it becomes in the mind of the prospect. As well, the more convoluted, the more clever you try to be with your idea, the greater the odds of confusing the prospect, of having a prospect that doesn't quite understand what you're trying to communicate or convey. They don't quite get it. And like you've heard me say before, and a confused prospect doesn't proceed. Right? They're looking at your lead, they're looking at your headline, they're looking at your deck copy, whatever you want to call it, really the same thing. And they are making a judgment of whether they want to continue to engage with your campaign. The idea got their attention, but now right away, they're making a decision of whether they want to continue on. And if in your headline, if in your subhead, if in the first couple of sentences of your lead, you are confusing them, or you're not being clear, or you're not communicating in simple language, you are losing the prospect. And so that's why you've heard me say, and there are folks on with us right now that are still making this mistake. When you are developing big ideas, and understand this, that it takes a lot of ideas to find the seed of a big idea that you can develop. It takes work. It takes effort, without question. No comparison to the effort that it takes to write a promise-based headline. Everybody on here could sit down and within minutes write out a number of different promise-based headlines. That's easy to do. A big idea is what will drive your business, is what will drive a campaign. It could drive a campaign for months, if not years. I built the back of marketing funnel automation off of a single marketing campaign that we ran for 18 months, a single marketing campaign that built the entire backbone of the company. And so the thing that I want you to understand, though, is that when you are developing big ideas, when you are fleshing out potential big ideas, when you're brainstorming and mulling over what it is that you've examined in the marketplace, your research, first of all, you've got to be patient. But secondly, the thing that you need to do is you need to get clarity on the idea before you try to write copy. Let me say that again. You need to get clear on the idea before you try to write copy. One of the biggest mistakes that I see marketers make that are new to developing these amazing ideas for their marketing is they immediately go into copywriting mode. They immediately go into copywriting mode and they immediately try to write copy. And what often happens, because for many folks, it's difficult to write copy, right? Especially newer marketers. They end up clouding up and mucking up what is a potential good idea with just a poorly constructed headline, with poorly constructed copy. And the copy ends up masking the quality idea. And so you always want to recognize, and listen to me carefully here, and this you want to write down. Write down. The presentation of the idea is not the same as the idea. The presentation of the idea is not the same as the idea, because you can have a great idea that gets presented with great copy, it gets presented really well, or you can have a great idea that gets presented poorly with weak copy or just poor grammar, poor word choice, whatever it may be. And so you've got to recognize that the idea is not the same as the presentation of the idea. The presentation of the idea is the second step after that first big step of getting clarity on the idea. And that's why those of you that have been around for any significant length of time with me, you've heard me say before, when you are developing your ideas and when you want feedback on the idea, you are much better off just presenting the idea as if you were at a social gathering. If we were hanging out at a cocktail party or a dinner party and you said to me, I've got a great idea, check this out, you wouldn't immediately rattle off a headline to me. You wouldn't immediately rattle off copy to me. What you would do is instead you would just pitch the idea, right? And when you're pitching the idea, when you're presenting the idea, the important thing is that you've got clarity on the idea, right? So that you can present it with clarity, simply, right? Succinctly, easily. I'm not worried when you're pitching the idea of how many words you're using, or right, that's not going to make for great copy. That's not what we're looking at during that pitching stage. During that pitching stage, it's all about, do you have a clear idea and how compelling is the idea, right? Because like, understand this, a weak idea or an idea that is not compelling, no matter what kind of copy you use, it's not going to be good. Right? So great copy skills don't make up for a weak idea, but a great idea can make up for weak copy skills, because often a great idea just needs to be presented simply and clearly. And that's it. Right? And so that's the first thing that I want you to recognize. You want to make the idea the priority, not the presentation of the idea. You want to make the idea the priority, because once you've got a good idea, presenting the idea is easy to do. It's much, much, much easier. And so you make the idea the priority, not the presentation of the idea in the initial step. And so how do you know if you've got a good idea, right? Like, how do you know if you've got a good idea? I'm not talking about necessarily a big marketing idea, right? You already know the criteria for that: new, unique, fresh, timely, easily understandable, one idea. It's intellectually interesting, emotionally compelling. How do you know if you're onto something that is a good idea?